Thank you for being here, and we're good? So we're still waiting on Mark Bibbins, but he'll be here in a minute. Last night I was talking to a physicist who compared his long-standing research on a single subject to working on a sequence of poems. Everything had to be perfect, exact, and that would take a very long time. We're in a moment when minute by minute our emotions change, our estimations change, our opinions change, and poetry is weirdly out of place and weirdly ideal. It can be a reprieve, and it can be a place of profound, sudden revelation. Since 1973, Copper Canyon Press has been publishing extraordinary poetry, recognizing that poetry is vital to language and living. This 50th anniversary event celebrates the press and the many poets it has embraced by way of the anthology Personal Best, Makers on Their Poems That Matter Most. Tonight, we'll hear from the editors and contributors. Erin, Belieu, and Phillips, wearing their editorial hats, will host poets Jericho Brown, Mark Bibbins, and Cate Marvin in this reading and conversation. In our age of search, I won't read bios, but I will share a few words about the poets. Of Jericho Brown, Ilya Kaminsky writes, his lyrics are memorable, muscular, majestic. His voice in these lines is alive, something that is quite rare in his generation of very bookish and very ironic poets. Brown's poems are living on the page, and they give the reader that much, a sense of having been alive fully. Publishers Weekly of Mark Bibbins and his collection, they don't kill you because they're hungry, they kill you because they're full, writes, with a title that perfectly encapsulates its tone and potential energy, Bibbins harnesses his venom and directs it toward those social forces that serve to numb people to the violence of their stultified lives. There's urgency even in its moments of quiet and beauty in every explosion. And Cate Marvin, via Publishers Weekly, can make you laugh at crying and cry at laughing, yet few works so rife with satire ever took the human condition more seriously. Even at its most composed, it flashes with temper, merging the metaphysical and the dramatic, and arriving at unpredictable resolutions. Thank you to Copper Canyon, Casey Torres, Marissa Vito, Joseph Bednarik, executive editor, Michael Wiegers, who will follow me to the stage, and our editors and poets, and Lori Lynn Turner, the Associate Director for the MFA in Creative Writing here at the New School, and everyone for working so hard to put together this extraordinary evening. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, I'm Michael Wiegers, the executive editor at Copper Canyon Press, and I want to thank you all for showing up tonight. We're here, of course, to celebrate the launch of Personal Best, and we're also here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Copper Canyon. This is one of our last. Thank you. This is one of our last events of our 50th anniversary celebration, and I can't think of a better way than to celebrate, poets talking proudly about their own work and what it means to them, and I'm grateful for the people who have made it possible, from our board, some of whom are here, as well as my colleagues at the press, who both present and past, who have made it possible to do the extraordinary work that we do, and to really highlight what the poets and editors tonight are highlighting, the importance of individual expression, the importance of the solitudinous nature of writing and of reading that honors individuals and honors independent visions and voices. as I was walking here just a few minutes ago, I got a text from my daughter who was sitting in a lecture and on medieval history, and somebody said, and the speaker Mary Beard said, "We need poetry because it's poetry." And I was thinking, tonight we need these poets because they're poets, and they help us re-envision the world, reimagine the world, and see ourselves along the way. And toward that end, Copper Canyon over the past 50 years has been learning to see itself and envision itself for the next 50 years. I'd quickly like to thank again our board of directors. I see you in the audience, and I know there are others out there watching online, and I'm grateful for all the work that you do to make the work of the press and my colleagues on the staff possible. You are great supporters of us and make it fun to come to work every day. So thank you. I also want to thank a couple of supporters from the National Endowment for the Arts to the Hawthornden Foundation to Lannan Foundation to and on to our individual donors and who, as a nonprofit, make it possible for us to do the work that we do and make beautiful books. And mainly, I want to thank our poets who, over 50 years, have made it possible for us to join with them in building a community of poetry and of books. And also, lest I forget to do so, I want to thank one of the original founders of the press, Tree Swenson, who is also here with us tonight. And it's her shared vision with a community of writers and poets that made this possible for us for 50 years. And Tree, we're grateful for what you've built and what you've allowed all of us to steward. And toward that end, I'm going to step aside and look forward to listening to our poets tonight talk about their personal bests and the importance of the work that they've done over the years. So, thank you.
So, welcome. We're very excited about this. And we were going to, Erin and I were going to talk a little bit about how this came to be, this anthology, and then we'll explain the format, do some introductions, and hear from our lovely poets.
And I also want to say, congratulations to Copper Canyon on 50 years, and thank you to all of the many people in this room who've loved and supported the press and the poets whose work, come out of there. And I've been really lucky to be a part of Copper Canyon for many, many years. Happy birthday, Copper Canyon, and we love you, and we're glad you exist.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were going to say more. Okay, well, we wanted it to be spontaneous. I wanted to say that what happened is, I feel like we were having one of our many grousing kind of talks, Erin and I.
We start every morning with a grousing text exchange, is what it comes down to.
And it's like this, where there's these interruptions and everything, and lots of judgment passed. And we were talking about probably some poem of one of ours that was in an anthology, and thinking, oh, why that poem, and why do they always pick the poems that we don't really love, as opposed to the poems that we think most reflect our genius and brilliance.
Which is usually the last poem we wrote, honestly.
Yes, it's always the newest one, because we
Right.
just had
That's
a break.
the brilliance, right.
Changed poetry as of yesterday or something. So I think it might have been you who said, there could be an anthology where we all, people had to pick their own idea of what they would, anthologize.
Yes.
No, you have to say more than that.
Yes.
She said the same thing.
Because I guess one of the reasons I was thinking about this in Carl, our conversation made me think about something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I've been teaching inside of academia for many, many years, and there are many things that I love about that. I do sometimes feel like the makerliness and the focus on the maker. And, you know, we've all heard about the death of the author. That's not new. And there was part of me that sort of feels like this idea of the maker, for me personally, I can't make a statement for anybody else, has sort of gotten lost sometimes in more recent years. And so I've really been interested in the idea about, you know, as we say in our introduction, that I've always believed that a poem is just someone's consciousness on the page, right? And so I was really intrigued by this notion of what people believe about their own consciousness on the page. So that's kind of where the idea started for me.
Yeah, I think I thought it was a good idea from the start, but once we started getting actual mini essays, the charge was for people to select one poem that, it doesn't have to, I know the book is called Personal Best, but it often, what people most often would say is, this isn't, I don't want to pick a favorite. I don't have one poem that is my best poem, but there would often be a poem that they felt either reflected them very accurately, or had been a poem that always had meant a certain thing to them, that, or a poem that had been overlooked, but they always treasure it in some way. So it's not always your favorite poem, but one that somehow is important to you. And I think that what was exciting to me is the different approaches, how people, well, also the rest of the charge was, besides picking the poem, to write a brief, though not everyone stuck to the assignment, but everyone here did, a brief essay talking about their choice, why they made this selection. Likewise, the poem was supposed to be a certain length, but some people obeyed and others didn't. So yes, you'll see some poems in there that are 15 pages long at some point. Well, there you go. But that's all right. That's all right. It all counts. In the end, it seemed to me a sort of amazing choir of voices. And when we were selecting people, that was the hardest part, maybe.
It was incredibly difficult.
Yeah, whom would we invite? And knowing that we would make enemies. Probably.
No.
Oh, yes.
Poets are generous. Poets are kind.
Well, maybe they just email me and say things like, why am I not in the anthology?
Probably.
But,
that's probably it.
But we did have some parameters. One, people couldn't be students of ours. And,
or lovers.
well, right. There's obvious connections like that. Yeah, some people manage to squeak in, but it had to be, we wanted also to have an eye towards diversity, obviously in terms of identity, but also aesthetic diversity. And yet, we didn't want the book to be pitched as a diversity book in that sense, the way that often, it seems an easy way to package things, but really to just show a range of the types of voices, including a lot of people here who have one book or two books, and people who have many, many books. And so in terms of where they are in their careers, I think it's an exciting reflection of that. Would you like to say something more?
No, I think that pretty well sums it up. It was a real pleasure to work on the book. It was a real pleasure to work with Carl. We've been friends for 150 years and never done this kind of work together. And except for one snarly moment on the phone.
Yes.
I think
you were snarly, yeah. That's okay. I've forgiven you.
Yeah, but I mean, it was a real pleasure to work on this and to sort of see the ars poetica that each person's poem sort of ends up being, along with their essay. So, and we're so grateful to Copper Canyon for sort of taking our pitch and thinking this was a good idea.
Yeah,
so,
believing in it.
Oh, and the last thing I will say is that one of the things that also made us interested in this is that I have done a lot of teaching in high schools. Obviously, I'm a college teacher. Carl was a high school teacher for many years, and also obviously teaches in academia in university. And so it really meant a lot to us to sort of try to entice and woo young readers into the art and magic of poetry. And so while I think it's true that this book can be read by, loving amateurs all the way up to the pros, that was close to our heart as well, thinking about wanting to bring more young people into the, imaginative universe of poetry. So I hope it finds its way to young people's hands.
Yeah, which is also to add that part of the charge for the poets was in writing their sort of mini essays to consider that audience and to be writing about poetry. And the idea is that people might pick up this book and say, oh, poets are actually, there are real people behind these poems, instead of sort of thinking they're mystical figures or distant or not even alive. And so
you and I
showing
both,
vulnerabilities.
both of us come from a space where, I grew up in the suburbs of Omaha. I don't think there were a lot of poets in your family. And just having those people that, I always thought that writers lived in lofts in New York, and that's the only place
I
that
thought they were all dead.
or dead.
Yeah.
Dead
just
in
books.
lofts in New York.
Yeah.
And so, so just letting younger people know that artists come from everywhere. And you don't have to have grown up in a particular way to make the art. So
Yeah.
that's probably enough, right?
I think it is. So to talk about the format, we're going to have a brief, I'll introduce everyone at the same time up front, and then each of the poets is going to read for 15 minutes, and including their little mini essay, but other poems besides the one poem in the book. And then we'll have a little discussion among ourselves.
We shall chat.
Yeah. So, essentially, I'm reading what they have offered us, although some people didn't give us much information, so I added more because they were too modest.
Jericho.
Well, that's how it goes. So, we have Mark Bibbins over here. He's going to start. We're going to go in alphabetical order. Who's the author of 4 poetry collections, most recently 13th Balloon from Copper Canyon Press in 2020, which received the Publishing Triangle's Tom Gunn Award. His first book, Sky Lounge, which was from Grey Wolf Press in 2003, received the Lambda Literary Award for poetry. And he lives in New York City, teaches in the graduate writing programs at the New School and Columbia University and in NYU's Writers in Florence program. I myself feel I met you as when you were a child and you were told to walk me from dinner to a reading at Fordham. And I don't know, it just seemed like, who is this teenager who is leading me through the streets of New York in case I couldn't do it myself? And here you are, all grown up.
Please welcome.
I was going to say please welcome, but I forgot. We're doing all the intros right away. Oh, and then that brings us to Jericho Brown. I've also known for a long time, who is the recipient of a Whiting Fellowship and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for poetry, and is the author of 3 books of poetry, Please, the New Testament, and the Tradition, which happened to win the Pulitzer Prize for 2020, I believe. Yes, 2020. He's originally from Louisiana, now lives in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to say still teaches at Emory, but is that true? Oh, you didn't mention that. Huh. But that's okay. No need to say it all. There's so much to say. Isn't there, Kate? So,
I say too much.
no, you say great things. Cate Marvin is the author of 4 books of poems, World's Tallest Disaster, which won the Kate Tufts Poetry Prize, and Fragment of the Head of a Queen. They were both published by Sarah Band Books. Her 3rd collection, Oracle, appeared from Norton in 2015. A recipient also of a Whiting Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship, Kate is a professor of English at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. Her 4th book, Event Horizon, was published by Copper Canyon Press just last year. She lives in southern Maine. I think that is everything that you need to know, and we are going to have, after much discussion, the poets themselves will, what, did I leave something out?
No.
Oh, are going to go and read
To the podium?
Okay.
It was a bold decision.
There was controversy, but that's what's happening.
Please welcome Mark Bennett.
Yes, please welcome Mark.
Was very kind, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, it's wonderful to see you here tonight. Thank you, John, Reed, and everyone at the New School. Thank you, Michael Wiegers, and everyone at Copper Canyon. It's absolutely bonkers to me that I get to read alongside Kate and Jericho. And of course, I'm profoundly grateful to Erin and Carl for including a poem of mine in Personal Best, not only because I'm in such extraordinary company, but because I've been reading and loving their poems for as long as I've imagined I might be able to write a few myself. First, I'll read a slightly tweaked version of the essay that appears after the poem in the anthology, and then the poem, which is called At the End of the Endless Decade, and then a couple of newish things. Okay. Some poets are happy to talk about their own work, while others are more reluctant. I fall into the latter category, so I'll start by mentioning something that might be of interest in the context of the book whose release we're celebrating tonight. The word anthology comes from a Greek word meaning flower gathering. Not to generalize, but poets tend to get a kick out of such information, so I doubt this will be the last time you hear this bit of trivia from one of us. You could also think of an anthology as a gathering of roots and stems and leaves and seeds. Among its pages, you might find a few thorns, or a bit of dirt clinging to roots, or a bee landing on a petal, or rain. I wrote what would become the first and last parts of At the End of the Endless Decade on an airplane while I was feeling exceptionally sad and tired, then promptly forgot about it. When I came across the lines in a neglected file a year or so later, I had no problem tapping back into that generative gloom and fatigue. I squeezed in a Cocteau Twins reference, partly because the poem seemed to want a bright spot, but mostly because their music changed my life. Perhaps an odd way to say thanks, but there are worse ways. The poem probably looms larger in my mind than it might have otherwise, because it was first published as part of the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series during the early weeks of the pandemic. To share your work with a room full of people can be a disorienting experience, as is realizing you won't be in a room full of people again anytime soon. But it's very disorienting to know that one of your poems is landing in the inboxes of more than 350,000 people and flying around the happy hellscape of social media in the subsequent hours. Then it's on to the next poem the next day. If I sound ungrateful, I don't mean to. It's wonderful that the Academy supports projects like Poem a Day, and I'm grateful to Dana Levin for asking me to submit something when she was guest editing the series. A year and a half later, I saw that someone had shared the last lines of the poem on Facebook. I didn't know him personally, but I knew that he lived in another country, a country that was going through extremely difficult and depressing times. That narrows it down, doesn't it? I experienced those lines as if they had been written by someone else, and I hope it doesn't sound immodest of me to say that in the moment I actually found them moving. The poet and novelist Ben Lerner has observed that lines of poetry, and I'm paraphrasing here, feel more real to him when they are dislodged from the context of a poem and quoted in an essay or review. And here was a scrap of my own work, glowing alienly on a terrible website that plays no small role in making millions of people miserable, feeling real to me in a way it hadn't before, perhaps because those same lines felt real enough to someone I'd never met that he was moved to share them. And this is the poem At the End of the Endless Decade. For years, had anyone needed me to spell the word commiserate, I'd have disappointed them. I envy people who are more excited by etymology than I am, but not the ones who can explain how music works. I wonder whether the critic who wrote that the Cocteau Twins were the voice of God still believes it. Why not? What else would God sound like? Even though I know better, when I see the word misericordia, I still think suffering, not forgiveness. When we commiserate, we are united not in mercy, but in misery. So let's go ahead and call this abscess of history the Great Commiseration. The difference between affliction and affection is a flick, a lick. But check again, what lurks in the letters is lie. And what kind of luck is that? As the years pile up, our friends become more vocal about their various damages. Won't you let me monetize your affliction, says my friend, the corporation. When I try to enter the name of any city, it autocorrects to forever. I'm spending a week in forever. Forever was hotter than ever this year. Forever's expensive, but oh, the museums. and all of its miseries ours.
Mark, can I interrupt?
What? Yes, dear.
I think all of us need to speak up a little bit more for the
Really?
live stream.
Okay.
Bring out your Ethel Merman.
Okay. This one, the title turns into the poem. The world being unknowable but not unavailable is what rankles me today. I can't claim to have what anyone would call a full life, though it might be close enough. When I get on my platform, I'm the same height, only older. There are all these gaps in my so-called memory, but what if memory is the gap, the culprit in some other crime? Vandal, ulcer, tourniquet, thief. A tornado came out of the news and into my house last night, and aren't we all trying to grab one decent handful of sky before it kills us? I'm not saying the path I stumbled down was better, but some of you got smart in college and stayed that way. Incredible. I spent half my teens and most of my 20s prepping for death and still don't know how to do it. Now there's this kitchen but no house, around which the flowers grow inside out. If you tried to call it blooming, I wouldn't stop you. A new world growing out of the cracks of the last one. If there was a window, beyond it lay shadows cut from the softest wool. If there was a wall, someone hung the paintings on it upside down, but we didn't notice until it was too late. If there was a door, there was a door. You never get tired of the mistakes you don't learn from is a variation on the definition of insanity I could live with. Everyone turns their faces toward a light they can't feel. Everyone leans against the speakers as the singers outline opportunities they've taken or wasted. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, while night is good at dusting. And forgetting sounds like the most romantic thing, although to admit this reduces me to another sock puppet into which privilege has slipped its beguiling fingers. What else should I want, other than that the names of all these flowers remain available to us? I've heard naming the animals was our first assertion of power, though Eve might disagree. Mea culpa, hallelujah, hallowed be the bougainvillea that never grew or dwindled here. A ghost in every Rorschach blot, a hand on every knee. The dust has already settled, so why shouldn't we? Listen though, don't go away. I don't even think these are my hands anymore. If they were, they would be full of dead leaves and the ghosts I brought here with me, which is to say, the only ghosts I know. Erin likes it when I rant, but she doesn't like it when I'm self-deprecating. So,
That's about right.
nevertheless, so this is a working title, Garbage In, Garbage Out. Someone tweeted, "If your email finds me, I swear to God," and it got 60,000 likes. Amazing. It's basically hitting the lottery, but no money unless you have a compelling SoundCloud. If I don't find a suitable way to articulate my emptiness, I swear to God. Don't touch me if you're currently having a bad dream. We wouldn't exist if we weren't contagious. Some mornings I'll dream of riding a crosstown bus and suddenly being surrounded by verdant hills, and all it means is that I've taken public transportation into the past. If I had to describe my brand, it's the mysterious affinity I feel with people who have viewed my Instagram stories versus the sinking feeling I got when I realized my Instagram stories had automatically been posting to my Facebook stories. My brand is, I didn't realize I had to opt out of my brand. You'd be amazed at how many people think to gleam means to glean. Is there still a toothpaste called Gleam with 2 E's? Because that was weird, and surely another reason why so many of us struggle with gleaning. Aquafresh was weird too, but in a good way. In this essay, I will. People online are asking, why is it called a lozenge? Is lozenges a real word? What does lozenge mean in heraldry? What language is lozenge? It's 4:30 a.m. and I'm feeling compelled to take some janky pictures of the moon. I have too many neighbors, but they seem to be sleeping, and anyway, this really isn't a neighborhood. I call it Hell's Attic, so obviously I have a bright future as a realtor. I'm honing my angles, upping my filter game, taking my cut. Lozenge comes from a word meaning slab, and I guess that'll do for this moon. I admire its resistance to being adequately photographed by our phones, and I refuse to believe that's not a metaphor for poetry. In this essay, I will. I'm guessing there's a show called The Influencers that I'm not watching, and a movie franchise about autocorrect. I should remind you there was a show called Shit My Dad Says that was based on a Twitter account. My first Twitter handle was Shit My Grave Says, but it turned out we weren't ready for that kind of internment. 100 years ago, if you'd written a poem on your phone called Poem Written on My Phone, you'd automatically have been declared a capital S surrealist. I have a theory that you should go ahead and put contemporary ephemeral crap in your poems, because the effect will not be to date the poem, but to preserve the contemporary ephemeral crap as if in amber for when what remains of our culture is studied later on. Alice Notley said she liked her own poems because they were good as rocks. I don't know how many times she said it, but when you start repeating yourself, it means you found your voice. Okay. Multiple choice. A, hooray, with 2 O's. B, hooray, with a U. C, huzzah. D, hurrah. I'm glad I never said C aloud before I knew how to pronounce it correctly, because I would have rhymed it with hubba, as in hubba hubba. Gross. The humiliations I've been spared. Among the search results for hubba hubba are hubba hubba hamstery and hubba hubba tent. I didn't click on them, but you could. My kink is all the tabs I have open. And do I get more than one kink? Because my kink is also remembering where I was when some national tragedy occurred, which was invariably in bed with at least one cat. I used to think I'd made a successful love poem if I could show it to the person it was about and he didn't know. In this essay, the first step is admitting you have a problem. Joseph Brodsky said that fascism begins in the language. True, and it also begins in selfies and brand collabs and retweets. I guess there's a little language in all of us. When I see parents filming their toddlers trying to accost wild geese in the park along the river, I want to intervene, but never do. I keep writing important messages from the future on my arm and forgetting to send them. In this essay, I will. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so very much, Mark. And now we will hear poems from Jericho Brown.
Okay, so Carl let me borrow his book because it has my essay in it. I'm going to read the poem first, and then I'll read the short statement, which I wrote this a while ago, so I don't know what the short statement says. I'm very excited to see. I'm very excited to see because I didn't remember the poem that I sent. So looking at the poem I sent, I'm like, what was I thinking? So it's a poem I hardly ever read, and maybe I'll talk about why. Pause. From bed to dresser drawer, and all while rolling latex down, he'd whistle, and I felt daily at first a chore, a long walk without trees. If anyone, I should have known. I who hate for people to comment that I must be happy just because they hear me hum. I want to ask if they ever heard of slavery, the work song. The best music is made of subtraction. The singer seeks an exit from the scarred body and opens his mouth, trying to get out. Or at least this is how I came to understand Willie whistling his way into me. What was my last name? Did he remember? Had I said? We both wanted to be rid of desire, how it made even the shower a rigorous experience. It driving my coughing Corolla across Highway 90 at the darkest time of morning. It opening his dead bolted door. us splayed as if for punishment at every corner of the carpet, then pause for the condom, elastic ache against death, heavy in his hand, and something our fingernails couldn't reach, itching out a song. He was not content. He was not bored. If I had known the location of my own runaway breath, I too would have found a blues. Poor Willie whistling around my last name, wrapping his gift in safety. Poor me thinking if the man moves inside me, I must be empty. If I hide inside the man, I must be cold. I love this poem because it was the first time I felt myself need what I was writing as I was writing it. I had my entire life been hearing writers say that the work should be a process of discovery, that the best way to do it was to allow one word to lead to another, one line to lead to another. All of that seemed a lie when I first began. Nothing as perfect as the poems I wanted to read could have been written so instinctively. Also, I was afraid. Writing without any idea of what I might end up saying is still scary for me, but now it's also exhilarating. When I started this poem, though, I was very aware of and surprised by the specificity of its opening lines. And I was also surprised that I was willing to move away from them without immediately explaining how they were connected to an overall scene. The breakthrough was that I had anything at all to say after the first sentence. I was learning to leap and pivot and meander, and that felt like writing. I was finally doing the damn thing I was born to do. If I had been any more aware of myself, if I had planned things out, the poem wouldn't have ended up queer. And it definitely wouldn't have found a way to couch that queerness in an experience that is particularly Black. I mean, I wrote the Black queer poem because I was not trying to write it. I was just being myself and allowing the next line to say what it must, even though every line needed to tell all my business. I just dealt with the fear as I moved forward because I had gotten to the point where the poem was more important than my fear. I had also gotten to the point where I could respect my fears while also understanding that they were either unfounded or based in a very dumb need to capitulate to the beliefs of those who would have me dead. I remember this poem when I'm writing now because the feeling I had writing it is the feeling I work toward today. I want to know as I go that I am finding my subject. I think that writing this poem also taught me what people mean when they say the writing is the reward. I never imagined it in anthologies or even affecting anyone in any particular way. What the poem was doing for me, the satisfaction of learning it as I was working on it, that was its payment. Understanding that made me feel more powerful, more bold as a person. If I could say what needed to be said here, maybe I could say what needed to be said. If I could enjoy writing the poem without thinking of being compensated with applause, maybe I could find use for all of my work, whether or not it ever got reviewed or awarded. So that's what I said. And thanks. So I'll also read a poem that I think is that I just remember. I mean, I'm reading ultimately I love the idea of this anthology. I think it's such a good idea, and I see how it could be a really great teaching tool for me in particular. But this idea of writing without knowing what you're going to say next was a huge breakthrough for me. This next poem is probably showing a little bit more of that. That first poem was from my first book, Please, so I thought I should read a poem from each book. Since I only have 3, it won't take that long. But this next poem I sort of had this goal when I was writing my second book that every line would be such a far-flung and surreal surprise. And so here's a poem that I sort of see. I see myself trying that out. Homeland. I knew I had jet lag because no one would make love to me. All the men thought me a vampire. All the women were women. In America that year, black people kept dreaming that the president got shot. Then the president got shot, breaking into the White House. He claimed to have lost his keys. What's the proper name for a man caught stealing into his own home? I asked a few passengers. They replied, Jigger. After that, I took the red eye. I took to a sigh deep as the end of a day in the dark fields below us. Some slept, but nobody named security ever believes me. Confiscated my Atripla, my Celexa, my cortisone, my Clonopin, my Flexeril, my Zyrtec, my Nazarel, my Percocet, my Ambien. Nobody in this nation feels safe, and I'm still a reason why. Every day, something gets thrown away on account of long history, or hair, or fingernails, or yes, of course, my fangs. And then I'll read a duplex. The duplexes were made, the duplex is a form I invented that is at once a huzzle, a sonnet, and a blues poem. And I'll read one from you now, but they were made quite literally from every, many of the poems in the tradition actually were made this way. I kept these files. And one file was simply titled Very Long Lines, and another file was titled Very Short Lines, and another file was titled Medium-Sized Lines. And from that file of medium-sized lines, which was quite literally every line that I have written in every poem failed, and every line that I had just laying around in the notes app of my iPhone or any notebook. I kept all the lines that were 9 to 11 syllables, and I printed all of them out, and then I cut them up into slivers of paper. And each of those slivers of paper would push me toward a decision about what my first line was. In the duplex, your first line is the same as your last line, so 2 down. It's a 14-line poem. And you only need 7 lines to write a duplex. I get so excited about this. Anyway, it's like 7 lines and I'm done. And I kept just making couplets with those lines. And so it was very important for me in that moment to see that it was possible through juxtaposition to make a certain kind of emotional meaning happen by taking 2 things and slamming them together, even though they had nothing to do with each other, definitely had nothing to do with each other narratively, if that makes sense. You'll hear it, I think, when I read the poem. But many of the poems in the tradition were made that way, so it's actually hard to narrow down. But I'll read a duplex. But for instance, there are poems in the book. There's a poem called For a Day in the Morning, a poem called Hero. All of those poems were literally made because every line I ever had written that mentioned my mother, I printed those lines if they were, and I just said, oh, here's all these lines with my mom's name in them. So then I put all those lines together and made poems from those, which was really helpful to me in thinking about, I do believe this, that if the line is the unit, if you have a good line and you have, cumulatively, if you have a bunch of lines that you think of as exciting or original or new or weird or strong, then you can make a good poem if you have good lines, which has been so useful to me in terms of generating new work. Duplex. I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse full of medicines that turn in the sun. Some of my medicines turn in the sun. Some of us don't need hell to be good. Those who need most need hell to be good. What are the symptoms of your sickness? Here is one symptom of my sickness. Men who love me are men who miss me. Men who leave me are men who miss me in the dream where I am an island. In the dream where I am an island, I grow green with hope. I'd like to end there. Thank you.
I too want to thank Copper Canyon and New School and Erin and Carl. And it's very exciting to be reading with these poets. And I think, an anthology is such a labor. I don't know if you're aware, it is so hard to put an anthology together and get all the rights and the permissions and this and that. And you're always having to chase after people for things, right? Because they're running away from you. And you need to get these things. And so I edited one a long time ago, and it's very fresh in my memory of how very difficult it is. And it's a labor and it's a gift. And I think that what I love so much about this one is that it's about making. And poets are makers. And I loved Jericho. It's amazing to hear you talk about your process, because it explains a lot to me when I'm teaching your poems, because sometimes we're like, well, how do we put this together? It all fits, but what's up, And I'm in total agreement that like the unit of the line is like, it's like a building block or whatever. So it's really exciting. This is the stuff that poets get really excited about. I am going to read I don't know what I'm going to do first. So the thing is that Erin, of course, was coming after me for my little essay, and I was, avoiding it, and I wrote it very quickly, and I also don't totally remember what it says. So it's a longish poem. Okay. I'm just going to read the poem first. Okay, it's called My First Husband Was My Last. My first husband was my last. If not for this one fond thought, trees wave their violent weight, heaved in air with storm's hand. They confiscated my hair elastic. They confiscate my bra. They confiscate my bra as each could twist into a noose, my bra wire sawed into a shiv. And we were both stubborn, asleep side by side until the night before we would never again sleep side by side. Neither of us was willing to be put out, sleep on the couch. Falling into bed, he dropped his mouth by my ear to mutter deep, "You'll drink yourself to death." Yet we had much in common. We were both nocturnal as bats. We both smoked furiously. We each had a tendency to interrupt people mid-sentence, though we each hated nothing more than being interrupted. We each had a tendency to hurl death threats, enormously seductive on first impression. Once our targets succumbed to our wiles, we stared back at their love, appalled, our eyes dead diamonds. We voted Democrat and loathed the rich. We considered our intelligence unassailable. We were unbearable. Yet my fondest memory is when he arrived to bail me out of jail, and I do not intend a metaphor. He was the only one who saw me wince when they tightened the handcuffs. It was for his ear I'd quoted Keats while being walked into the precinct. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. Never an early riser, he did not fail to arrive at jail near dawn. I saw him pacing before that plexiglass partition, serving as portal to the room in which I stood wearing the obligatory orange jumpsuit in an orange blaze thick with the company of other women who had also done some bad things wrong. I had run a yellow light. He wanted his late-night snack at the country kitchen, heard the sirens stop us, thought in fright my bowels might run loose down the insides of my pants leg. Trying to walk true to the line, so scared shitless was I suppose any man who ever hopes to know me must know this about me, that that's why I drove that night. Yet it's also true that night foretold how a shadow can strive to overshadow another shadow. Some of us apparently wake only for these sorts of battles. For though I lay silent, assigned to rest on the cell's concrete floor on a thin pallet, thrummed asleep by my cellmate's snores, the thought that I had arrived at a punishment so terrible made me feel a certain kind of pride. Like my dear friend who died, who was not my ex-husband. He is, I'm told, still very much alive. told me how he threw himself off from trees he had climbed to see how he'd bleed when he was a child. Feeling the damp from concrete walls seep ache into me became just another way I found to feel myself alive. Yesterday, I received notice I'd failed to pay a civic fine, a penalty I incurred from an arrest that the court long ago dismissed. Although I distinctly recall filling out a sum of $200 for that particular money order back in 1999, payable to the Iowa Department of Motor Vehicles, no record of this payment exists, though judging by the clerk's sharp glee tickling the ether as she read aloud my crime from off a computer screen, although 14 years have slipped beneath us all, and I can't remember that town's street names, I'll never buck the mean notoriety of that sad local newspaper's entry, DUI. I was placed in a 48-hour lockdown program as reprieve, as a first-time offender admitting my offense, a program operating, would you believe, out of the Heartland Hotel in Coralville. A bunch of drunks under one roof being taught how to not use alcohol, reminded how each of us had fucked up to the point each of us wept. Among us, a 16-year-old who drove herself into a snowbank well over the legal limit. And me, I was feverish to leave so as to be back with him, my first husband, who had scored a good lead on pot from a friend I made over that weekend. Every bit of this is off record. They confiscated my hair elastic, even the mugshot, which I can only hope has been destroyed. Terrible dark then, my hair rode its idiot storm atop my head. What's utterly queer, yet remarkably clear in retrospect, is how I felt a freak urge to sneer or grin at the flash. They let me keep my underwear and socks. They confiscated my pocket change and wedding ring. And if not for that one moment, when I stood within the gaggle of orange-suited women, one of whom growled, "Drunk driving? You'll be back." That I saw him pass before the plexiglass as he saw me, looked back, and he mouthed me against it all, "You look beautiful." My stare drained within the fluorescence. Could I forget any of it ever happened? He told me I would die as I lay beneath our shared coverlet. He told a shared acquaintance I did not care for the written word. This was in itself blasphemy. So I was the cunt who cut his vocal cords, or I was rich and hid my treasure. He kept company with petty thieves. His one friend stole coins out of laundry machines. He's familiar to me as a dust mote. He's familiar to me as a carved wood mass we hung on our walls. He's agape, always agape. My first husband was my last. He's my love canal. It's a miracle anyone ever married me. It's a miracle anyone ever married him. He's digging himself up in Transylvania. He's pulling the stake out of his heart with his yellow teeth. His awful teeth aren't his fault. He was raised inside a tin can. He was suckled with corn syrup instead of breast milk. I think of him at the polls. I feel his thoughts collect like chalk dust in my nose. I wake up in a sweat. I wouldn't be surprised if I woke up next to him tomorrow. We are celebrating the 4th of July. I have brought home a rotisserie chicken, which we enjoy pulling apart and licking its grease from our fingers, and later we'll find ourselves in our bed, the bed in which we will make death threats to one another, upon which we shall blame one another all of our bitter, long lives. I once slammed the door in his face so hard, if he had been standing an inch closer, his fangs would have been knocked down his throat. Or rather, landing ass flat at his door's parting slap, tailbone cracked, I chose to clatter back down the hall, my pinchers snapping through the smoke waters we'd made of our habitat. The only reason we got married was because we didn't know one another. But it is not true that I chased him with a kitchen knife, ever. So, I'm going to read my essay. I wrote the first draft of this poem in 2009. I felt cynical back then. It seemed to me like all the poems I was reading in magazines resembled the cars I drove beside on 3-lane highways, identical makes and models, and little variation between those. The nostalgic poem eyeing family dysfunction through chiseled metaphor. The lubricated poem shimmying alongside theory, making no real sense. Surrealism so mass-manufactured you might expect to find it discounted at TJ Maxx. The extremely proficient ekphrastic. More than anything, I despised the proficient ekphrastic. I hated my poems too, of course. I wanted to write something that ran counter to them, something elegant. But I have never been elegant. I nursed the idea that my third book would be airy and erudite, a sort of lofty series of elegies strung along the clouds, a semblance of removed yet pained poems, unlike anything I'd heretofore been able to write. I wanted nothing to do with the heavy-handed, emotional plunges my poems always dragged me into, their lyrical spin cycles and insistence on the lurid. I deserved a vacation, not only from the typical habitats my poems occupied, but also their habits. I wished to write at a remove. My first husband was my last, might not have broken through if I hadn't just had a baby. I was completely exhausted and had no use for conventions to which I had previously cleaved. I didn't care if people might associate me with my speaker. When a title came to me out of the blue, probably when I was attached to a breast pump, I laughed out loud. The poem announced itself as a voice of my next book, heralding poems that would move even further into the realm of the lurid. So much for elegant poems. My first husband was my last is about failure. Formally, this poem took many years. I repositioned and rearranged the stanzas too many times to go into here. I was most worried about positioning the pin of this poem, which is the moment at which the speaker is done in. She sees her husband through the plexiglass window as she is being held with other women in jail after being arrested, and she is wearing the orange jumpsuit. The husband sees her, meets her eyes, and mouths that she's beautiful. This appeals to her vulnerability and vanity. She bites. Being arrested for drunk driving when I was 29 was something I did not speak or write about. Thinking about it made me sick with shame. So I was taken by surprise by this poem's sudden appearance. It arrived whole. It was uncharacteristically long and unwieldy. I had no idea how to revise it. Also, it made light of situations I had long held in fragile regard. It laughed at me and it made me laugh. The poem appalled and delighted me. But the poem is also about how things will come back to haunt you. The writing of this poem occurred between 2009 and 2014. In 2013, I went to a DMV in New Jersey to get a new driver's license. I was prevented from doing so because I owed a fine to the state of Iowa that dated back to the time of my arrest in 1999. At the time, I'd been told everything would be wiped from my record, and I had a distinct memory of preparing a money order for the amount of $200. The amount the woman I was now speaking to on the phone claimed I owed them. I could feel her reading my infraction from the computer screen in front of her. In her voice, I sensed judgment. I think this poem is nostalgic, too. I will never have a first husband again. There were a lot of things I liked about him, and he lives in my memory the way the smell of smoke never leaves a house that's had a fire. So I'm going to read 3 poems. They're nowhere near as long as that. This first one is called Skims. And I was very happy when the young woman at the hotel pulled these poems off of a printer and recognized what Skims are, right? So it's a brand of shapewear that Kim Kardashian designs. Skims. It's sad to see you, Kim Kardashian, in this strange room streamed to my screen. A walk-in wardrobe a family of 10 could live in. A scene I arrive upon with a witless click. You're sharing your new brand of underwear. They make you, as if we should care, as if our hearts are for sale, like the shapewear your mind has given birth to. And while I don't care about the boy shorts you'll wear around the house when you're not feeling like wearing lingerie, please, I'm starting to care more than I care to admit about you. Sitting here with you in my mind's midnight, feeling you and intimate. I'm worried about you. If you knew me, would you worry about me too? The more alone I feel, the less real I feel. The kind of alone we feel is real, intergalactic, projected into outer space in a pair of underwear without air. In this cocktail hour of a nowhere zone, we flow alchemized. Can't you see? We've been had, lured with the fantasy of children by husbands who lie. That's like the wrong version of what happened. So this next poem is called Botox. You need Botox. The alarm on my phone sounds. My face winces. It's never liked needles. But what it does or doesn't like is not my concern. It's not my resting bitch face, my face for a long time. My main beef with it has been the snarl between its brows, how it alarms others with its announcements of disbelief. You can judge me all you like. A problem was solved. If and when he made a particularly stupid remark and my brows rose, his face snapped into a snarl, and he rose to show that if I allowed the expression to again meet the surface of my face, it would surely be quashed, as one might a kitten they're trying to drown in a pond, or trash that needs shoving further down into a bin. My face, the fears it has abound like birds in spring. It's altogether easier to have no expression at all. But my forehead feels it will crash down on my eyes like a weighted window sash. For a long time, I carried my face in a sandwich baggie in my purse, taking it out only to buy groceries. Now I sleep with it on. And this poem is in response to, everyone always talking about the death of the humanities, and I wrote it actually, the original draft I wrote for commencement for my English department, for my students. The death of the humanities. Apparently, we are all lying here beside one another in a darkened room around 2 a.m., giddy as if at a sleepover, each of us waiting to see who speaks last before the other dark hits hard. Here we are lying side by side one another in our caskets, chatting on the verge of dying. These coffins sure are comfortable, and I love sipping my iced coffee while feeling snugly, as if I've been spooned into a sleeping bag beneath a night delicious with stars' clarity. Stars bent to kiss my face, the eyes of a beloved who knows who my favorite author is, who gives me Red Comet for my birthday. Why do you say I'm dying when I am reading? Holding the hand of an author I know like a lover, yet who died years before I was born. Why are you telling me I'm dying when waking feels like a birthday, like the tendrilled feet of butterflies that land on an open palm? Reach down into my heart, squeeze its pump, feel its big yes. If this is dying, I like dying. If this is a coffin, I like its bed.
Thank you, Cate, Jericho, and Mark. Fantastic readings from all of you. And so we're going to have a sort of conversation in that way that you ask questions and people answer them as a conversation, sort of. And I was thinking about how making has, obviously it's in the title of the book, and how it's come up in a couple of the readings. And I'm curious about the making of poems versus the making of prose, and what any of you have to say about that, what the difference was. Because a lot of people, of the contributors, when they were told you'll need to write something, they would panic about the prose part and say, oh, I don't actually do that, or I don't feel good about it. And they were very apologetic, many of them, when they turned it in. It's like, oh, I know this is probably no good. And of course, they all were quite good. So I'm curious, not that you all haven't written prose in some way here and there, but what were your experiences? Anyone who would like to begin? Would you, Cate? Just get it going.
I'm not sure I have an answer for that, actually. I mean, I did feel very panicky because I still feel a little uncomfortable about that poem, but I think what happened was, when I wrote it, I was coming to an understanding of what was happening when I wrote the poem, and then I discovered that, that there's like this like remaining love in the poem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, I didn't realize that until like when I sort of finished. I was actually, I kind of like my first husband, and that was like, it took me like a long ass time to get there and recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in terms of the actual writing of prose, I only really do it like about poetry under duress.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
I understand. And I mean, I hate writing prose, and yet I seem to often be doing it. But part of my thought behind my question was exactly what you referred to. Was there something you discovered in the process? Because I get the feeling many of you did discover something more about the poem or about yourselves in the course of doing that.
It offered this really sort of unusual opportunity. Well, first, both prompts did. To choose the poem offered an opportunity to go back and look at your work, sort of as a reader, also as a maker and a reader, and to think about what that poem meant to your life's work, really.
Yeah.
Because for me, that poem was that was one. I really believe that I like serve my poems, and I'm supposed to bring them into the world, and that poem just showed up. It showed up, and it really broke through because I was so tired. It broke through. It was just like, it was so funny, and it kind of like, and it was just it was really magical in a lot of ways, and it also dissolved my shame around this thing that I felt really horrible about. But okay, so it did that, right?
Yeah.
But then also. It's like well, usually when you're done with your poems, you send them off and they go out in the world and you read them and stuff like that. But often you're more interested in the poem that you're working on at present. And then, so that, it kind of put me in relationship to past work that I hadn't been in before at all, because I just don't think about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also writing. What I think is good about the assignment is that it asks you to be really internal about what you've done as a writer, and not at all academic, maybe not at all intellectual. I think part of the maybe the word is trepidation around writing about one's own work is that we are indeed trained not to have anything to say about our own work. You're really just not supposed to.
You have your speaker.
Yeah, you have your speaker, and then that separates you from being in a position where you have to maybe you would talk about things, in a class about how you go about doing something if you're giving a student advice, but to write about what you did is almost putting yourself in a position of critic. And so you have to find a way to write without, it's one thing to write about somebody. I could very easily write about somebody else's work. And so because I'm not critic, it's ultimately sort of asking the question, and it's not a question we get to answer a lot, but it's sort of a question of autobiography, right? And how are my poems a part of my autobiography, which is something I think we are sort of, when you watch an autobiography of a poet, they're doing everything except writing poems. And it's part of the reason why we hardly ever, there's the Keats autobiography you can see a movie of, and the play I thought of, but we sort of don't like these movies because it's like, well, writing a poem is not visually interesting. It's just,
And you get kind of like sweaty and gross while you're doing it because there's so much intense thinking. It's like so not glamorous.
Hi. Oh. Well, for me, I've said this before, but I make the analogy of, for me, as opposed to poetry, writing prose is like swimming with clothes and boots on. It's just not how I'm wired. And I think, like for the assignment, which I actually ended up enjoying doing, even though I procrastinated as long as possible, for the anthology, I feel like when I'm writing poetry, well, Gertrude Stein, I say this all the time too. Gertrude Stein said that she wrote for herself and strangers. I feel like when I'm writing poetry, I'm writing also for myself and strangers. When I'm writing prose, I'm just writing for strangers. and that kind of, I don't know, that ends up making me really self-conscious about the tone in ways that I'm not when I'm writing a poem. And what Jericho said about the different line lengths, I realize that whatever wiring I'm stuck with, I think in phrases that tend to be, correspond more or less to the lines of poetry that I write. And so I find myself when I'm trying to write prose, just these little like 10 or 12 word phrases come out, and then I have to figure out how to make them go together and how to turn them into longer sentences, and God forbid to come up with a longer, coherent idea that the whole piece is speaking to. So it's just like that.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting pressure to, not that I'm a contributor to the anthology. That's one of the other rules, that Erin and I would not be in our own anthology, because we don't think that's very good manners. But I used to think that with poetry I needed to get lost in order to write, and with prose I had to have a sense of where I was going. Though I've started to like writing prose more because I just treat it like poetry and get lost. But I do feel the same thing, that I had to forget the strangers, and because I thought, or I'm supposed to sound smart in prose, and with poetry I can just be dreamy and weird, something like that. Help me out here, Erin.
Do you want me to ask another question?
Yes. Make me stop talking.
Well, I actually want to say, look, I think that the process of writing the thing is sort of, there is an aspect of autobiography, because you have to talk about, okay, well, where does this poem come from? And if the poem is really important to you, it is sort of, it's often a monument to something like in your life. And we don't we want to have the freedom of you can say anything in your poem, be anybody, like a poem is like an amazing disguise. But it is they're connected to our lives, of course. So it's sort of like, it's like admitting something almost, that this is it came out of your lived experience, or finding the origin. So it feels a little naked, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, is it me? I'm sorry. I'm hoping that maybe we have some, high school and college age people either watching this now, or that they'll be able to see this as a sort of resource that we'll make available for some of the younger writers that we had positioned the anthology toward in part. And so I know one of the things that I really wanted to know as a young writer, and I know my students are often really interested in, and I'm trying to think about how to say this concisely, but everyone here has been a maker for a long time and has managed to actually build their life around this art. Which is sort of astonishing when you think about it, right? It's not like America is always going here, let us help you be a poet. Let's give you more money and more time. It's not usually like that, right? And I'm curious how all of you ended up coming. How did you actually discover your connection to making when you were younger? What gave you the temerity and the grit to make a life in writing?
I think I remember being in maybe 7th or 8th grade and reading some E.E. Cummings and just thinking, well, that seems better than how I'm usually asked to talk. And then I didn't really read any poets for a long time, and just kind of wrote horrible little things on Post-it notes. And I don't remember exactly when. As Carl mentioned, you sort of, you might think of, well, the poets, they're dead, they're not around. I didn't realize people were alive and writing poems and publishing books and having careers. I was kind of a sheltered person, I guess I won't say sort of what happened after that, but because it's going to sound it's going to sound lazy. I don't know what incredible luck it's been, and how grateful I am to in this part of my life to have been so lucky to be able to do this, but especially to do it among such incredible people, many of whom are in this room, many of whom are students of mine and or former students of mine, these amazing poets. Yeah, I just feel lucky. I'm just kind of waiting for it all to disappear.
So you're saying it was a giant accident, and you could be like a dentist right now. It's really what it comes down to.
A bad dentist, but yes.
What about you guys?
So I was like kind of I just always felt like a weirdo and kind of, and a bit of a failure or whatever. And so it was like I started writing poems. I read a lot. And in Watership Down, they had all these epigraphs, and I was obsessed with Watership Down. So I ended up like starting to write poems, and then, and I guess, I started to turn them in for extra credit. I wrote a poem as a book report, and that went through, and then I had a teacher in 7th grade who was really into poetry, and he was like, and everyone was just like, this man is so crazy and weird. But he would hand out these dittos of all these poems and get really excited about them. And then, but on the first day, he was like, does anyone here write poetry? And I was just like, and then I look around and I'm like the only person in the room, right? But it was really great. And then in like 10th grade or 11th grade, I was really doing very poorly in school. I was really depressed, but I submitted these poems to a literary magazine at my high school. That was a really good magazine, and they got accepted, and I was like, oh, this is the shit. I was like, this is what I'm doing. And also my parents like read so much, and we had books all the time, and I've been thinking lately that was a really huge gift of permission. They never said, no, don't do that. And so that, I want to actually like really thank my parents for that. And then also naivete. Like I just kept going, and also I really feel like it's like the only thing. It's what I'm meant to do, and it's the thing I do best. And I'm always astonished when there's other things that I can do well.
I haven't answered because I'm trying to in my head narrow my answer down. This is I'll just say it feels good, and I think how I feel is important. So when I'm writing, I like writing. I like literally how I feel while I'm doing it. I like figuring out an image or figuring out a metaphor. I like that feeling. And I think somewhere along the way, I just decided how I could make myself feel was more important than the fact that other people wanted my life to be about how I made them feel. Do you know what I mean? And I just had to put myself first. And I think I was able to put myself first, number one, because the act of writing feels good. And I was able to put myself first. Just, I think in many ways, a lot of what has happened out of spite, So many people told me very directly that I wouldn't be able to do individual things that I've done, and that I wouldn't be able to make this life happen for myself. And I just think it was my intention, having heard that from people, even people in my family, even my parents, my intention of having heard that from people was for many, many years to prove them wrong. And a lot of what I've done, sometimes even to prove poets wrong, people within my own community who I felt were somehow rude to me, or who, for whatever reason, I felt didn't think that I had the chops. I really just wanted to show them that I could do it, which is weird because, after you show everybody you can do something, you still have to be able to write poems. So, which is what I talk to my therapist about all the time now. Because, it doesn't actually, you have to really do it because you love to do it and not because of other people. Because, like my dad, for instance, cannot say out of his mouth that I have a Pulitzer Prize. Like he just can't do it. So it's really good that I had my dad as sort of this counterpoint to fight against through my work. But it's also kind of weird realizing that nothing I do in my work is going to make my dad any different. Do y'all know what I'm saying? And so if it's not gonna make my dad any different, why am I writing poems? So then I have to like sort of start over every time. Anyway, that's the answer.
That reminds me of, of my father was a military intelligence analyst and didn't talk about his job at all, and really didn't like to tell stories, didn't like to talk about shit. And I'm like his nightmare because I like to talk about everything and overshare, and the whole thing was just obscene, So in a lot of ways, I feel like it's like an act of joy, And so when I first got out of college, I had a temp job at an insurance agency, and I told my father, I said, I don't like this job, and he said, everybody hates their job. Get used to it. And I was like, I don't think I can. I don't think I'm going to. And then I had this year that was fairly miserable. And then I went into my MFA program, and I was just like, wow, here I go.
I think we're getting the time. The time is up. Notice.
The time is up.
I know. We had 50 more questions.
We just got here.
But thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really glad you were here. And the anthology is available over here, and the poets will sign it for you if you would like to do this over in this corner with these lovely people sharing the book with you. So thank you all for coming very much, and thank you to all the people on the panel today. This was really wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Okay.